Tonight's presentation is titled Carbon Monoxide, Silent Killer. And our presenter is Mike Bush. Mike is president of Savvy Aircraft Maintenance Management. He's a CFI and also an A&P mechanic with inspection authorization. He's an author for numerous aviation publications. 2008, he was FAA's Aviation Maintenance Technician of the Year, and he's a member of EAA. Mike, thank you so much for being with us tonight. I'm going to turn control of the presentation over to you.
Well, good evening, Tim. Good evening, everybody. As Tim said, the topic I've chosen for tonight is carbon monoxide. We seem to have a carbon monoxide accident just about every year. A lot of close calls. About half of the carbon monoxide related accidents are fatal ones in my research. So this is pretty serious business. And mostly, not all, but mostly they happen during the winter. So it seemed like an opportune time to discuss this subject. I got real interested in carbon monoxide back about 18 years ago, 1997, when a very high-profile general aviation carbon monoxide accident occurred. And although it was 18 years ago, you may remember it because this was all over the national news. It got a tremendous amount of publicity nationwide. And AOPA and EAA were getting lots of questions from the press back then. But basically, the story was that on January 17th in 1997, an instrument-rated pilot, experienced instrument-rated pilot in his 40s, and his 71-year-old mom, who happened to be a newly minted private pilot herself, which I found interesting. Not many 71-year-old newly minted private pilots, but that was the case. The two of them departed from Republic Airport in Farmingdale, New York, out on Long Island, at about 11:15 in the morning on a VFR flight destined to Saranac Lake, New York, up in the Adirondacks. And the airplane was a Piper Dakota. This was essentially the flight that they planned. It was supposed to be about a 2-hour flight. And less than a half an hour after takeoff, the pilot in command lost consciousness. The pilot-rated passenger, the mom, took over the controls, called Boston Center, declared an emergency, told them that the pilot in command, who was her son, was unresponsive and vomiting. And the controller then took the next 20 minutes or so trying to take her down to a landing at Bridgeport, Connecticut, basically the closest reasonable controlled air near where she had declared the emergency. He was not successful in talking her down, and about 9 months after she declared, she reported to the controller that she was now experiencing nausea and fatigue. The controller managed to arrange for an Air National Guard helicopter to take off and form up with this Dakota. And the two of them, the controller and the helicopter pilot, both tried to talk the woman down to a landing at Bridgeport, but without success. Ultimately, the mom passed out as well, and there was no further communication from the aircraft. And the aircraft headed north-northeast, being pursued by this helicopter until it climbed up into the clouds and disappeared from view. And ATC continued to track the flight for nearly 2 hours. Headed up in this direction. And then about 2 hours into the flight, apparently whichever fuel tank was selected must have run dry. The aircraft rapidly descended out of the clouds and crashed into the woods near Lake Winnipesaukee up in New Hampshire, killing both occupants, the pilot in command and his pilot-rated mom. The FAA and NTSB arrived on site at the crash site. They did tox on both the pilot and the mother, and those revealed that the pilot in command's blood had a level of monoxide poisoning, or carboxyhemoglobin, a saturation of 43%, which was sufficient to cause convulsions and coma. And the mom's carboxyhemoglobin saturation was even worse. It was 69%, which was right on the verge of what it takes to just kill you. In the meantime, NTSB metallurgists inspected the muffler on the aircraft and determined that it had a large pre-existing crack and an irregular hole, both of which appeared to have been leaking exhaust gas for some time based on the pattern of exhaust gas stains, and that the leaking muffler and the fact that it was wintertime and the cabin heat was turned on is apparently what caused the high levels of carbon monoxide in the cabin and resulted in the incapacitation. NTSB probable cause report came out and stated that the probable cause was pilot incapacity due to carbon monoxide poisoning. As I said, the mainstream media, which back in those days was mostly the networks, was all over this story. It just dominated the TV news that day and the next day. I remember that about a week after the crash, Bruce Landsberg, who was running the AOPA Air Safety Foundation at the time, issued a press release cautioning pilots about the dangers of carbon monoxide, recommending that pilots of single-engine aircraft install a CO detector, but at the same time stating in the press release that carbon monoxide accidents are extremely rare, in Bruce's words. I was curious about just how rare they were and did a little bit of research and concluded that they weren't quite so rare. When I took a look at the NTSB accident database, this was again in 1997, and looked back for the previous 15 years, I came up with quite a number of carbon monoxide related accidents that were reported by the NTSB in all kinds of aircraft. And interestingly enough, not all of them occurred during the winter. There are some of them that occurred in July and August. But there were quite a few accidents. They averaged, just a little bit, one a year. And as you can see, quite a few of them were fatal accidents. And these are only the ones that the NTSB reported on. Nobody really knows how often pilots become ill in flight as a result of carbon monoxide and attribute it to something else like air sickness or hypoxia or fatigue. But as far as I can tell, CO poisoning is probably much more common occurrence in general aviation than it's generally given credit for. I think it's a significant problem. And I know some of the research I did at Cessna Pilots Association, where we started getting sensitive CO detectors in aircraft, revealed a much higher incidence of CO problems in the cockpit than anybody expected. And I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. Let me briefly mention the last accidents on this list, which also happened, in December 1997, and that involved a crash of a Comanche 400 being flown by a family practice doc by the name of Bob Frazier. He was flying his Comanche 400 over Kansas. He lived in western Kansas, and he was flying the plane to Topeka when he fell asleep at the control. The airplane was on autopilot at the time, and it flew on autopilot another 250 miles before it ran a tank drop. And then, miraculously, the airplane glided to a soft wings level landing in a hayfield. The good doctor got the airplane with just a few minor scratches, stumbled to a nearby farmhouse and called assistance. He was taken to a hospital, and 2 hours after the airplane went down, they measured his blood carboxyhemoglobin, and it was 26.8%. Most likely, it was much higher at the time of the crash landing than it was at the time they measured it, so it was probably well up in the 30s or maybe even in the 40s. The airplane was inspected. The right muffler was found to have a large crack around one of the weld seams in the muffler. The good doctor was extremely lucky, of course, to walk away from this accident. It's pretty unusual for an airplane to land on autopilot with an incapacitated pilot and make a soft landing that you can walk away from. So this one was very, very lucky. Close. If you think that this sort of thing only happens to older aircraft or poorly maintained aircraft, you might be surprised to know about another situation that happened literally 2 weeks after Dr. Frazier's accident, again in December of 1997, when a professional ferry pilot, a female pilot, was flying a brand new Cessna 182S from the Cessna factory in Independence, Kansas, across the Atlantic Ocean to deliver it to a buyer in Germany. Fortunately, the incident happened before she got across the ocean, or before she got to the over water leg of the flight. As she was flying up, I think, in eastern Canada, prior to starting the ocean crossing, she started feeling ill, was experienced enough to suspect that it might be carbon monoxide related, and made a precautionary landing, which was a good thing that she did. The examination of the muffler on this brand new, right out of the factory, Cessna 182S that probably had less than 10 hours on the aircraft, uncovered defective welds in the muffler that allowed carbon monoxide to enter the cabin. Cessna then performed pressure tests on all of the 182 and 172 mufflers that they had in inventory at Independence, and discovered that 20% of them had leaky welds. They reported this to the FAA. The FAA issued an emergency AD, and all of the airplanes in the field with these mufflers wound up having to have them pressure tested, and a lot of them got replaced before anybody else got hurt. So this happened with brand new parts. Interestingly enough, there is no requirement for manufacturers, even of the latest Part 23 aircraft, like this 182S, to test their aircraft for carbon monoxide when they're doing the flight testing of the aircraft after it comes off the assembly line. Um, Another interesting incident that happened a couple of years later in January 1999, there was a Cessna 206 that was being operated by the U.S. Customs Service. It was on a night training mission down in Florida when it inexplicably crashed into the ocean, or into the Gulf of Mexico, I guess, a few miles off of the South Florida coast. The pilot survived, but he had no recollection of what happened. The NTSB investigated the accident, called it simple pilot error, never mentioned carbon monoxide as a possible contributing factor. I'm not even sure whether whether a toxicology test was done on the pilot. Actually, no, I take it back. Enough carboxy hemoglobin was found in the pilot's blood that although the NTSB didn't consider it a factor, the Customs Service suspected that it might have been a factor. And so the Customs Service took it upon themselves to purchase a bunch of sensitive industrial electronic CO detectors, one for every single-engine Cessna in its fleet. And when they did that, they discovered that a bunch of their airplanes had significant carbon monoxide in the cockpit problems. Ever since that, onboard CO detectors and periodic carbon monoxide checks during maintenance inspections have been standard operating procedure for the Customs Service. But this is something that is almost never done in the civilian fleet. It probably should be, but it has not been common practice, and most maintenance facilities don't even have any carbon monoxide instrumentation to do such checks, even if they wanted to. So much for the war story part of the webinar. Let me talk to you a little bit about physiology, and a little bit about carbon monoxide detectors, and a little bit about what you should do if your carbon monoxide detector goes off in flight. And by the way, let me mention the abbreviation chemical formula for carbon monoxide is CO. And it amazes me how many people talk about carbon monoxide and call it CO2. CO2 is very different. CO2 is non-toxic. Maybe it contributes to global warming or something, but it's not what we're talking about. We're talking about carbon monoxide, which is a very serious poison. Carbon monoxide is invisible, it's odorless, it's colorless, and it's impossible to detect with your senses. The only way to detect it is with special instrumentation. And if you don't have special instrumentation, by the time you are affected by it, it's probably too late to do anything about it, because the half-life of carbon monoxide, as we'll talk about, is very, very long. And once it gets into your system, it takes a very long time to get back out. Carbon monoxide is a byproduct of incomplete combustion of fossil fuels. When fossil fuels are completely combusted, they produce the byproducts of that combustion are carbon dioxide and water, both of which are harmless, except maybe in the global warming sense. And I don't think private planes produce enough carbon dioxide to get past the noise level. But high concentrations of carbon monoxide, the poisonous stuff, occur in exhaust gas when the combustion is incomplete, and that happens when the engine is running a rich mixture. In other words, there's not enough air to burn all the fuel, and the result of that kind of incomplete combustion is carbon monoxide in the exhaust gas. If you lean aggressively, particularly if you're running lean at peak, the combustion is relatively complete, and there's hardly any carbon monoxide in the exhaust. And if you have a sensitive CO detector, you can actually see that. If you move the mixture control, you can actually see the CO level go up and down as you move from a rich mixture to an aggressively lean mixture. So how does this carbon monoxide, that's the product of incomplete combustion, and it occurs mainly during phases of flight where the mixture is rich, taxi, takeoff, initial climb. It's much less of a threat in cruise if the pilot is in the habit of leaning aggressively during cruise. But during the phases of flight where the engine is intentionally being run rich, carbon monoxide in the exhaust is fairly high. So the next question is, how does that carbon monoxide get into the cabin? And the most common way for large amounts of carbon monoxide to get in the cabin is through the cabin heat system in single-engine aircraft, because most single-engine aircraft have a cabin heat system that involves passing fresh air over a heat exchanger that's part of one or both of the aircraft mufflers, and the air gets heated by being passed over the hot muffler and then goes into the cabin. So if the muffler has any sort of leaks in it, even little pinhole leaks, carbon monoxide can get from the exhaust gas into the ventilation air and get into the cabin that way. However, one of the things we found in doing our CO testing, particularly on Cessnas, is that smaller amounts of carbon monoxide, enough to make you ill, although probably not enough to incapacitate you completely, can enter the cabin many other ways, even if the exhaust is perfectly leak-free and the cabin heat is off. We've seen significant amounts of carbon monoxide get into the cabin through things like incompletely sealed firewall fittings, through the tail cone, which typically is not airtight in these aircraft. We've seen a whole bunch of cases in both Cessnas and Moonies where air-conditioned aircraft that have an air conditioner sitting in the tail of the aircraft and have vents that pick up outside air for the air conditioner on the tail will breathe exhaust gas that's coming out the tailpipe and conduct that exhaust gas into the cabin. So if the exhaust gas has a lot of CO in it because the engine is running rich, you wind up with significant amounts of carbon monoxide in the cabin. We've seen problems with wheel wells on retractable aircraft that aren't completely sealed, allowing carbon monoxide into the cabin. And these are all things that are almost never checked during maintenance. Checking whether the wheel wells are leaked or airtight or that sort of thing. It's almost never checked. And unless you have a sensitive CO detector in the cabin, you'll never know that there are these kinds of levels of CO contamination in the cabin. All you'll know is, after a 2-hour flight, you wind up with a headache, but you won't know why. What happens when you breathe carbon monoxide? When CO is inhaled, it combines with the hemoglobin in your blood to form a very strong bond called carboxyhemoglobin. And the carboxyhemoglobin bond is about 200 times stronger than the normal bond between hemoglobin and oxygen. And so the carbon monoxide basically puts your hemoglobin out of commission and prevents it from carrying oxygen to your various organs, and it puts them out of commission and keeps them out of commission for quite a long time, as we'll see. The symptoms of carbon monoxide poisoning are myriad. They include initially things like headache, fatigue, dizziness, double vision, tunnel vision, nausea, increased pulse rate, increased respiration rate, These are all kind of non-specific symptoms that are often attributed to things like flu or indigestion or the common cold, where they're actually being produced by CO poisoning, but the symptoms aren't specific enough that you can know what the cause is. And so frequently feelings of malaise like this are not attributed to CO poisoning. They're attributed to something else incorrectly. At higher concentrations, then you may suffer things like shortness of breath, loss of consciousness, collapse, convulsions, coma, and ultimately death if the COHB concentration gets high enough. As I mentioned, the half-life of carboxyhemoglobin is surprisingly long because the bond between CO and hemoglobin is very, very strong and very hard to break. The typical half-life of carboxyhemoglobin is more than 5 hours. So, for example, if you were the good doctor who landed in the hayfield with a carboxyhemoglobin saturation of around 40%, after 5 hours, your carboxyhemoglobin level would drop to about 20%. Still enough to incapacitate you and make you quite sick. And after another 5 hours, it would drop to 10%, which is probably enough to make you woozy and headachy at altitude, but probably not enough to mess you up while you're on the ground. So it takes a long time to get this stuff out of your system once it gets into your system. Now, if you breathe 100% oxygen, which is what happens if you go to the hospital with CO poisoning, the first thing they do is they slap an oxygen mask on you and have you breathe 100% oxygen. That reduces the half-life to about 2.5 hours. But it's still pretty long. It still takes a long time, even breathing 100% oxygen, to get the carbon monoxide out of your system. Let's talk about how much carbon monoxide is too much. And this is a really controversial subject. It kind of depends on who you ask. There are all kinds of guidance, and I have my own opinions on the subject, which I will share with you. But to begin with, the EPA calls for a health hazard alert if carbon monoxide in the atmosphere rises above 9 parts per million for 8 hours, or above 35 parts per million for 1 hour. The FAA requires, when certifying a new Part 23 aircraft, that it be demonstrated that carbon monoxide in the cabin not exceed 50 parts per million. But they only require that during the certification testing. They don't require it for production of the aircraft. So once the design passes FAA muster, the manufacturers never have to test the aircraft again. And in particular, they don't have to test individual aircraft that might have, say, a leaky firewall or a defective muffler or something. They only have to pass this test during certification, not during production, which I think is probably a mistake. In 2010, the FAA issued an SAIB that recommended, but not required, checking of CO levels at every 100-hour inspection. But this is almost never done unless you happen to be the Coast Guard. And very few shops even have CO testers. So this kind of testing is hardly ever done. And there are lots of airplanes flying out there with CO levels that are unhealthy and without being detected. We're going to talk a little bit later about CO detectors and which ones I recommend for use in aircraft. But the UL-approved residential CO detectors that you find at Home Depot or Lowe's or hardware stores they are not permitted to alarm until carbon monoxide rises above 70 parts per million and stays there for at least 4 hours. This requirement written into the UL spec was demanded by firefighters and gas utility companies in order to reduce the incidence of nuisance calls from homeowners. In other words, they petitioned UL to make sure that residential CO detectors weren't very sensitive because they didn't want to be getting called out all the time. So CO has to rise to a quite significant level, 70 parts per million, and stay there for 4 hours before a residential CO alarm is allowed to go off. And yet, ironically, most fire departments require that their firefighters put on oxygen masks when the CO level exceeds 25 parts per million. So there's a little bit of hypocrisy there when it comes to fire departments. Another thing that's important to understand is that all of these various guidelines are kind of based on being at sea level. And low concentrations of carbon monoxide are much more hazardous to GA pilots than they are to normal people, because most GA aircraft are unpressurized, and the effects of altitude hypoxia and CO poisoning are cumulative. So when you're at altitude, you're already partially compromised or impaired because you're at altitude and you're partially hypoxic. And so it takes less CO to get you in trouble up at altitude in an unpressurized airplane than it would on the ground. So in my judgment, the criteria for what levels of CO are unsafe should be quite a bit lower for unpressurized aircraft like the ones we fly than the criteria that are normally used for buildings and stuff down on the ground where hypoxia is not an issue. For example, a low level of carboxyhemoglobin saturation of 10%, which is about what you'd get from chain smoking cigarettes, would probably not impair you noticeably but when you're on the ground. But if you were up at 10,000 feet at night with a COHB sat of 10%, it could certainly degrade your night vision, give you tunnel vision, probably degrade your judgment, and perhaps give you a splitting headache, because the effects of that carbon monoxide poisoning and the altitude hypoxia involved at flying at 10,000 feet would be cumulative. So again, we're much more vulnerable to it when we're flying than most people are when they're doing their normal stuff on the ground. So my recommendation is that every single engine aircraft, every single engine piston aircraft, should carry a sensitive electronic CO detector, and I'll talk a little bit about what kind of CO detectors I think you should use. That any time in-flight concentration of CO rises above 10 parts per million, you should make note of it and bring it to the attention of your A&P mechanic and try to find out how that CO is getting into the cockpit. And anytime there's an in-flight concentration above 35 parts per million, my recommendation would be that you should land the airplane, make a precautionary landing, put an oxygen mask on if you have it in the airplane, land the airplane, and try to figure out what's going on that's causing carbon monoxide in the cockpit. Because carbon monoxide poisoning is a function of both the concentration of carbon monoxide and the length of time you're exposed to it. And so as the carbon monoxide level rises, you want to keep your exposure to it as short as possible. Otherwise, you're likely to get incapacitated, at least to some degree. And once that happens, even if you eliminate the carbon monoxide, you're going to remain incapacitated for a long time because the half-life of carboxyhemoglobin is so long. So finally, let's talk a little bit about choosing a carbon monoxide detector. And there's all kinds of carbon monoxide detectors available. I'm showing 5 different broad categories of carbon monoxide detectors here. And we'll talk about each one of them individually. First of all, these chemical spot detectors that you find in pilot stores and so on, I recommend staying away from them. They actually, in my view, do more harm than good. First of all, they have a very short useful life. They're only rated for 30 days. And I constantly get into airplanes and see spot detectors that have been there for years. And they've been dead for years minus 30 days. And having a chemical spot detector that's expired, which almost all of them seem to be, I think is more harmful than good, because it gives people a false sense of security that they're not being exposed to carbon monoxide. The other 2 bad things about these chemical spot detectors, one of them is that they're very vulnerable to being contaminated by any kind of aromatic chemicals or solvents or cleaners, or things that are used all the time in the course of aircraft maintenance. And exposure to aromatics can put these things out of business immediately. And again, you never know. The detector just doesn't turn dark, and you figure you're okay. Also, by the time these things turn dark, they're not very sensitive. And by the time that they turn dark, you're probably in serious trouble. You really need a lot more warning. If you see a carbon monoxide detector turn dark because you've been at 200 parts per million of CO for an hour, you're already in very deep trouble, and there's no way you're going to be able to get back out of it again. Because once you're poisoned, you're going to stay poisoned for a long time. So we really need to get have something much more reliable than this. Now, the residential detectors, which you find at Home Depot and so on, they're a lot better than the spot detectors, but in my opinion, they're not nearly sensitive enough for use in the cockpit. Because they are Underwriters Laboratory certified, and because the UL spec requires them not to alarm very early at the insistence of the firefighters and the gas companies, they're not allowed to even display any carbon monoxide on their digital display, if they have a digital display, unless the level has risen to 30 parts per million. They're not allowed to alarm until the CO is above 70 parts per million for 4 hours. And even if the carbon monoxide gets up to 400 parts per million, which is a huge concentration, the things may take up to 15 minutes for the alarm to go off. So they're intentionally dumbed down by UL certification. And as a result, to me, they're not really the right thing to put in the cockpit. They're better than the chemical spots, but they're just not sensitive enough for my taste, knowing what I know about this subject. The detector that I personally prefer, and that I have in my own airplane, is called a CO Experts unit. It costs a little under $200. It's a non-UL certified detector, which means that it can be a lot more sensitive, and it is. It will display CO levels as low as 7 parts per million. It will alarm at 25 parts per million. It has a very rapidly updating display. It updates the concentration shown on its display every 10 seconds, which makes it extremely useful as a sniffer, where if you see CO in the cockpit, you can move this thing around and find where the CO level is the highest, and hopefully locate how it's getting into the cabin. Whereas normal residential detectors, they only update their display once a minute, which makes them essentially useless as a sniffer because the update rate is so slow. So I really like this unit, and I think for under $200, it's pretty much the best bang for the buck that you can find for use in a general aviation aircraft cockpit. Sold by a company called aromedics.com online and probably some other places as well. Industrial detectors are also very good, but they tend to be kind of pricey. The lowest cost ones that I could find are $400 and up. This one that's pictured here is one called a BW Honeywell Gas Alert CO detector that at the time I made this slide was selling for $410. And it has the sensitivity required. It has a dual alarm system, and the low alarm goes off at 35 parts per million, so it alarms at a reasonably low level. There's nothing not to like about this unit except that it's pretty pricey. But this would be a very good choice as well, and it would be an excellent choice for, say, a maintenance shop that wanted to do regular CO testing of the aircraft at annual inspection time. And finally, there are panel mount detectors that are purposely built for installation in GA cockpits. A company that is best known for making these things is a company in Tucson, Arizona called CO Guardian. They are expensive. The lowest cost one with a digital display is $600, and they go up from there depending on all the bells and whistles that you want to put on them. They will display fairly low CO concentrations. I believe the display starts registering at about 10 parts per million. That's a good thing. They will alarm at 50 parts per million after 10 minutes, 70 parts per million after 5 minutes, or immediately above 400 parts per million. That's not quite as sensitive as the CO experts or the industrial unit, but it's not bad. The biggest negative about these panel mount detectors, other than that they're expensive, is that they're panel mounted. So obviously you can't use it as a sniffer. You can't move it around the cabin to try to find out where the CO is coming from, because they're hard bolted to the airplane. But they're good units, and if you want a panel mount unit, then you want something that you can wire into your audio panel and so on. These things are worthy of consideration. And the last thing I'll do before I open it up for questions is to give you a quick emergency checklist. What to do if your alarm goes off. I mean, first of all, I got to have an alarm, and I hope I've gotten that point across. And so, what do you do if you're flying along and the alarm goes off? And here's a suggested checklist that I would recommend you using. When you get a CO alarm, the very first thing you ought to do, if you have it in the cockpit, is to put on an oxygen mask and start breathing 100% oxygen. That will stop your ingestion of carbon monoxide and will speed the rate at which your carbon monoxide, your carboxyhemoglobin level will go down. As you recall, breathing 100% oxygen roughly doubles the rate, doubles or halves the half-life, or doubles the rate at which the carbon monoxide poisoning is dissipated. So that's the first thing on my checklist. If you have oxygen in the airplane, put it on right away. The next thing to do is to lean the engine aggressively, preferably lean a peak, because as we talked about, the engines don't put out much carbon monoxide when they're leaned aggressively. They mostly put out lots of carbon monoxide when they're running rich. So lean aggressively is the second item on the checklist. Third, if the cabin heat is on, turn it off. The cabin heat system is the primary route of entry, at least for large quantities of carbon monoxide in single-engine aircraft. Twin-engine aircraft typically don't use exhaust muff heaters. They typically use gasoline-fed combustion heaters, and those combustion heaters are generally designed so it's almost impossible for carbon monoxide to get into the cockpit, even if the heater develops a crack or a hole in it. So the most vulnerable systems are the cabin heat systems in single-engine aircraft that are based on running air over the muffler. Open all cabin fresh air vents, but don't open a window. Generally speaking, when you open a window, like the pilot storm window or something, it decreases the air pressure in the cabin, and so would actually suck more CO into the cabin than if you didn't open the window. So you want to open air vents that will pressurize the cabin. You don't want to open a window, which typically depressurizes the cabin, if you will. Then land as soon as possible. And if the CO levels were higher than 70 parts per million, or you have symptoms like headache or double vision or nausea, consider declaring an emergency with ATC. And when you get on the ground, consider the possibility of going to an emergency room and getting checked out. So that's the checklist, and Tim, that's all I have. We can open it up for questions if you like.
Okay, Mike, thank you so much. Wow, what an eye-opening, somewhat alarming presentation. Very good, excellent, though. Thank you so much for giving us this information. Question here. Let's see here. So question about Rusty has is wondering if you could please address that CO monitors appropriate for GA aircraft have a life of 2 or 3 years.
Well, it actually depends on, it's a good point, it depends on the particular kind of sensor that they use, and each CO monitor comes with instructions. In fact, some of the CO monitors, and the CO Experts one that I use is an example, they actually, it will actually shut itself down once the sensor has reached its expiration date, and force you to replace the sensor. The sensors in these things are electrochemical sensors that have an electrolyte in them, and the electrolyte will gradually evaporate, and eventually the sensor will run dry and stop functioning. The actual useful life of these sensors depends a lot on the conditions under which the airplane is stored. If it lives in a hot, dry climate, and especially if it's kept out of doors, the sensors will lose their electrolyte quicker than if the airplane lives in cool weather or is hangared. But the sensors do have to be replaced from time to time, and it's usually not that big a deal. And as I said, some of the units actually will deactivate themselves and put up, an error message on the display when the sensor has exceeded its useful life. Others kind of rely on the honor system that you'll replace the sensor, but they definitely don't last forever. On the other hand, they last a whole lot longer than the 30 days useful life of those horrible chemical spot detectors that you see in pilot shops.
On the portable sensor that you recommend, is that battery operated?
Yes, all of the ones that I talked about are battery operated, except for the panel mount units, which of course wire into the aircraft electrical system, and of course there's chemical spot detectors that don't use any electricity at all. But all of the others are battery powered.
Joseph's wondering, is the CO heavier than air or lighter? Would it be high in the cabin or low in the cabin at the floor?
That's a great question, and it's a question that I asked myself when I was looking into this stuff. And the Basically, the answer is that the difference in specific gravity between carbon monoxide and air is so slight that for all intents and purposes, the CO is fully mixed or dissolved in the air, and you can't really, it doesn't reliably float to the top or float to the bottom the way, say, propane, which is heavier than air, would do, or something like that. You can't rely on it separating out from the air in either direction. Is the best information that I was able to come up with.
Tom's wondering, can you hear detectors, if they've exceeded their limits, go off in flight over your headphones with headphones on?
Oh yeah, the CO experts unit that I have in my airplane, for example, when that alarm goes off, it is incredibly loud. It is painfully loud, and you could hear it through anything. And if I'm not mistaken, the industrial detectors also have a very loud alarm, because they are intended for use by people who are wearing headgear or hearing protectors and that sort of thing. So the alarms tend to be very, very loud indeed. The panel-mounted ones typically are wired in through your audio panels, so that you actually hear the alarm in your headset.
Had a couple questions here from some folks wondering if the detectors need to be calibrated, and if so, is that a regular scheduled calibration?
Well, that's a good question. The ones that I'm familiar with do not require calibration. They just require a periodic replacement of the sensor unit.
Okay, Terry's wondering, what's the current draw on a typical panel-mounted detector? He flies a 48 Stinson with just a 25 amp generator.
You know, I don't know the answer to that. You could go to the CO Guardian website and pull up the specs, but my guess is that it's very small. My guess is it's well under an amp. But I'm only guessing. If you really want an answer to that, go to the CO Guardian website, which is the company that makes most of the panel-mounted ones, and they'll have spec sheets on there and tell you exactly what the current draw is.
Lee's wondering, how would you check an airplane at annual? Would you flight test, or under what conditions would you check it?
Well, I think you could check it just during the post-annual run-up, because probably in my experience, the time that you see the most CO in the cabin when we have a CO problem is when you're taxiing around with a mixture full rich. In fact, with my sensitive CO detector, sometimes it will go off if I'm sitting in the run-up area behind another aircraft that's running real rich and putting out a bunch of CO. And if I taxi away from that aircraft, the CO level will go back down again. Those things are extremely sensitive. So I think it would be adequate to test them on the ground. Not too many shops are in the habit of flight testing the aircraft, and a lot of them don't even have access to qualified pilots that can meet the insurance requirements. Obviously, I would like to see every owner, particularly of single-engine piston aircraft, carry one of these things in the cabin so that it's being monitored all the time. But if you were doing maintenance checks, I think it would be adequate to do it during the post-annual run-up that's required by regulation. And I think if you had a sensitive CO monitor in the cabin, and part of the drill was to turn on full cabin heat while you were doing the run-up and see if the CO detector starts registering, I think that would probably be adequate.
Don's wondering if pressurized aircraft like a Cessna P210, have these same issues.
Almost never. I mean, it is possible for a P210 to get some CO in the cockpit while it's sitting on the ground unpressurized. But once the cabin is pressurized, it's almost impossible for there to be CO in the cockpit problems. Pressurized airplanes generally are immune from this sort of thing because the pressure differentials are such that any leaks anywhere, the air is going to go from inside to out rather than outside to in. So in general, pressurized airplanes are immune from CO problems.
And Jay's wondering, would an oximeter help detect CO levels through lack of O2? No,
actually, that's a great question. I'm glad you asked that. The question is, if you were wearing a pulse oximeter to monitor your oxygen saturation of your blood, and you started getting CO poisoning, would the pulse oximeter show you as getting hypoxic? And the answer is no. It would do just the opposite, because a carboxyhemoglobin looks to a pulse oximeter just like oxyhemoglobin. In other words, the pulse oximeter can't tell the difference between oxygenated hemoglobin and hemoglobin that's combined with carbon monoxide to form carboxyhemoglobin. And in fact, what the pulse oximeter does is it actually reacts to the color of the hemoglobin in your blood. It actually measures the color, and as you know, unoxygenated blood, say venous blood, tends to be sort of purplish or bluish, and fully oxygenated blood tends to be bright red. And the way a pulse oximeter works is it actually is able to measure the color of your blood through some fairly sophisticated techniques of passing a couple of light beams through your finger, and carboxyhemoglobin is bright red. I mean, blood that is poisoned with carboxyhemoglobin is bright red. And in fact, when somebody dies of carbon monoxide poisoning, and you find the body, back in the old days, that's how people used to commit suicide. You remember, by locking themselves in a garage and running their car. You can't do that anymore because the cars have catalytic converters, so you can sit all day in a garage with your car running and you won't die. But back in the old days, you could do that, and the body would always be bright red when it died from carbon monoxide poisoning, because carboxyhemoglobin makes the blood brilliant red. So it fools the pulse oximeter, and you cannot use a pulse oximeter to detect carbon monoxide poisoning. Excellent question. Thanks for asking that one. I should have mentioned that in the webinar.
And Kevin's wondering, with the small portable CO detectors, will they work well enough to leave it in your shirt pocket for people that just rent airplanes and just want to carry it on their body?
Well, if it's small enough or you have a big enough shirt pocket, the CO Experts unit that I have is about the size of your hand, so it would require a pretty generous shirt pocket to put it in. Maybe a jacket pocket would be better. You don't want to put it somewhere where it isn't exposed to reasonable airflow. So I guess my recommendation is don't, you can keep it in your pocket when you're not flying, but put it out somewhere when you're flying so that it gets air passing over it.
Walt's wondering, can natural sources like volcanoes and forest fires generate enough CO in the air to be a problem if one was flying nearby?
I don't know the answer to that. I suspect that it could. I mentioned incomplete combustion of fossil fuels, but I know that incomplete combustion of plant material can also produce CO. In fact, back when I was heavily into testing CO detectors back in the mid and late 90s, one of the ways we used to test them to make sure they were working was I would light a paper napkin on fire and then blow it out and let it smolder and stick it in my kitchen sink, and then put the CO detector into the sink, and the sink would fill up with measurable amounts of CO just from the smoldering napkin. It wouldn't you wouldn't see any CO if the napkin was burning with a full flame, but if you blew it out and just let it smolder so that the combustion is incomplete, you get lots of CO generated by that napkin. So I suppose that smoldering embers or smoldering tree trunks or whatever would also generate CO. What kind of concentration levels you would find when you're flying over that is something I have no way of knowing.
A couple questions here. Wondering if you can restate again the name of the CO detector that you use and recommend.
Oh, it's called CO Experts, and you can Google it. They have a website. I think it's coexperts.com, and the company that particularly sells them for aviation use that I'm familiar with is a company called Aeromedics, AEROMEDIX.com. I actually was a co-founder of Aeromedics years ago and got them into the CO detector business, and I subsequently got uninvolved with that company. My partner in that company, Dr. Brent Blue, wound up buying out my interest in the company. So I'm not involved with them anymore, but I'm the one who sort of got them started in the business of selling CO detectors. But I'm sure it's available from other sources as well. And the manufacturer, CO Experts, has a website, and they probably have a list of distributors on the website, I'm guessing. But it's the unit's called a CO Experts, and the last I looked, it was selling, I think, for $199 retail or something like that.
I wonder if Aircraft Spruce has those.
I don't know. That's a good question. They have pretty much everything, but I don't know whether they have those.
It'd be worth calling them. Maybe if they get enough requests, maybe they'd carry it.
Yeah.
So Merrick's wondering, where do you leave the monitor in your Cessna 310?
I actually sort of have it Velcroed down to the floor in between the two front seats, down in the general area of the fuel selectors. The location of it is not critical, except that you want it somewhere where you can go look at it and see the display without standing on your head. And you probably don't want to mount it like right in front of an air vent. You want it to be measuring sort of the ambient air in the cockpit. But other than that, it just kind of mount it wherever it's convenient. I have mine sitting Velcroed to the floor in between the front two seats.
And John's asking, why would a pressurized aircraft not potentially inject CO through the pressure intake ports?
Well, the question is, how's the CO going to get there? The air that pressurizes the cabin is induction air from the engine that's gone through the turbocharger and so on. And generally, the place where the induction air is picked up, which varies from aircraft to aircraft, sometimes it's somewhere on the leading edge of the wing, sometimes it's a NACA vent on the side of one of the engine nacelles, but generally it's not in a place that could breathe exhaust. And again, there's no cabin heat system that allows exhaust gas potentially to get into the cabin ventilation air. So, look, I don't know the design of every twin-engine airplane ever made, but it's the ones I'm kind of thinking about in my mind's eye right now. It's hard to visualize how exhaust gas could pollute the induction air that gets pressurized by the turbochargers and then is used to pressurize the cabin. Again, in single-engine airplanes, generally speaking, when you get at least significant levels of CO, it's because something was leaking. Something in the exhaust system was leaking. And in pressurized airplanes, because of the relative pressure differentials, anything that's leaking is going to leak out of the cabin, not into the cabin. But again, if there were any leaks in the induction or pressurization plumbing, those leaks would leak air out and not suck it in. So I guess without doing an exhaustive study of every piston twin made, I can't make a blanket statement that's impossible, but certainly in the twins that I'm thinking about, where I know the systems and the placement of everything, it seems highly unlikely that you would get CO in the cabin of a pressurized twin.
And Jeff's wondering, do you recommend pressure testing the exhaust system at annual to locate potential leaks that cannot be found with just a visual inspection? What do you think about adding some sort of sealant around the junctions of exhaust pipe sections?
Okay, well, two questions there. The first question is it a good idea to pressure test the exhaust systems? It's a great idea. And in fact, there are some airplanes, and I'm thinking of, for example, the Cessna 210, where pressure testing the exhaust system is required by airworthiness directive at every annual inspection, or in fact, maybe even more often than that, where they've had significant problems. But yeah, it's a great idea to pressure test the mufflers. And the procedure is pretty easy. Like I say, we do them on 210s all the time. You have to remove the outer part of the heat exchanger, so you can actually get access to the surface of the muffler, and then you pressurize the exhaust system with the exit air from a vacuum cleaner. You don't have to pressurize it by much, just by a little bit. And then you spray soapy water over the whole thing and see if anything blows bubbles. And that's a very, very good idea to do that. The second question, remind me again, Tim.
That was, would it be, what do you think about adding some type of sealant around the junctions of exhaust pipe sections?
Yeah, you can't really do that because exhaust pipes run too hot for you can't, put RTV or something on an exhaust system. It generally has to be a metal-to-metal seals because it just runs too hot for any sort of a normal sealant to work.
And question here from Yarav. He's wondering, will O2 cannules work as well? He says he doesn't have a mask for O2.
It won't work as well as a mask, but it would certainly help. Again, you're trying to get the oxygen saturation of what you're breathing as high as you possibly can. A mask is better. I always recommend carrying a mask. I mean, I always use cannulas in my airplane, but I always carry a mask for emergency purposes. I can't remember the last time I used it, but it's always a good idea if you have oxygen in the cabin to carry a mask just for emergencies, even though most of us use cannulas because masks are kind of a pain in the neck, especially for somebody like me that has a mustache. Mustaches and oxygen masks don't go together very well. But yeah, you do the best you can. Get the highest oxygen concentration you can with whatever you have available.
Just a comment here from David. He said, he says, I echo the recommendation of the CO experts unit. He said he has one, and it screamed, capital letters, suddenly during flight. To him one time, he said, muffler cracked in flight.
Wow.
And he said he shut down his heat right away, fresh air full on. He said he landed okay, and he said he will not fly it without it anymore. He's in a Piper Warrior.
That's what we call a good catch. Very nice.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. So Walt brings up a point. He says, do most electronic CO detectors have a silence button for false alarms?
Good question. I know that the CO experts does have a way of silencing it. I don't know whether that's... residential detectors, I think, typically don't, because I don't think they have any buttons on them. I'm sure the industrial detectors do, and I know the CO experts unit does.
So Steve's got a question, kind of getting to the root of this, which is exhaust system for cabin heating. He's saying, would fresh air drawn over cylinder fins or oil cooler provide enough warmth for cabin heat for mild, cold days?
Well, I must confess I have never seen an airplane that was configured with that kind of a cabin heat system. The only two that I've ever seen on piston aircraft are either a heat exchanger in the exhaust system or a combustion heater, the way most twins have and some single engine airplanes have, like the Cessna 195, for example, had a combustion heater for the cabin, and I think there are maybe a couple of other singles that have combustion heaters, typically old ones. Actually, maybe some pressurized ones too. But those are the only kinds of heat systems I've ever seen. Whether you could adequately heat the cabin with air coming from the cylinder fins, I'm not sure. Seems to me if you did that would be equally vulnerable to CO contamination, just because that air would be taken from the lower part of the engine cowling, and any kind of an exhaust leak down there would have the potential of contaminating that air as well. So I'm not sure you'd really be buying anything except not very good heat.
Joseph's just wondering, he said, Cessna can't be the only manufacturer that had problem with leaky exhaust causing, this type of CO problem. Is there any other manufacturers out there you can think of that have ADs with similar issues?
I honestly don't know the answer to that. I happen to know a lot about the Cessnas because back in the mid to late 90s, when I was deeply immersed in this CO stuff, I was doing an awful lot of work with the Cessna Pilots Association. I have not run into a lot of CO problems with Cirruses, which is what my company does more of than anything else right now. I do remember that we had some problems with Moonies, but my knowledge of this stuff is not totally well-rounded as far as make and model is concerned. If I was interested in Bonanzas, for example, I would be inclined to consult a friend of mine who's a Bonanza expert, because I don't represent myself as a Bonanza expert.
And Walt's just wondering, are there any long-term effects to breathing CO, or does the body recover completely over time?
Well, if it doesn't get so bad that there's organ damage, then it recovers completely. Obviously, if CO levels get high enough that you wind up going unconscious and starting to convulse, there's always a possibility that some of your more sensitive organs, like your eyes and your kidneys, might be affected, but it would have to be pretty bad. Generally speaking, most most CO poisoning is something you fully recover from.
Dwayne says, I've seen nose gear steering rods that had deteriorated boots where they go through the belly or firewall leaking gases enough to cause problems. He says as an IA inspector, he changes many of them during 100-hour and annual inspections.
Yeah, and we have the same issue, I know, with the twin Cessnas like I fly with Moonies and stuff, where the boots that seal up the push rods that actuate the main landing gears, because wheel wells tend to ingest lots of CO, and so it's really important that wheel wells be sealed. And when you have a mechanically operated landing gear, like Bonanzas and twin Cessnas and Moonies have, they depend on gas-tight boots to seal up those push rods so that the CO can't get into the cabin from the wheel wells, and so that's a similar situation to the one that you're mentioning with steering rod boots. Same problem.
And Walt's wondering, or Joseph is wondering, are there any over-the-counter drugs that can be taken to preemptively mitigate CO effects?
I don't think so. I don't think there are any drugs, prescription or over-the-counter. I mean, basically, CO just puts your hemoglobin out of business, and there isn't really anything that can stop that.
We've had a lot of comments, people saying it was a very, very good presentation, Mike, and we've pretty much reached the end of the substance of all the questions that have come in, so please take a couple minutes and wrap her up and share your closing comments with everybody.
Okay. Well, just just to preview the next couple of these first Wednesday of the month webinars. The December one is going to be on piston engine inefficiency, basically talking about why our piston aircraft engines only convert about a third of the energy in avgas into usable power, and what happens to the other 2/3, and what kinds of things that can be done to increase that miserable level of efficiency. In January, I'm going to be talking about the causes of maintenance errors and what we can do to minimize maintenance errors, and why GA maintenance tends to be more vulnerable to maintenance errors than say, airline maintenance. And finally, in February, we're going to be doing, I'll be doing a webinar entitled "The Lost Art of Repair," that discusses the repairing versus replacing things, and why we seem to have been moving into a world where the cure for aircraft ailments is to replace things instead of to repair them. And we'll talk a little bit about repair versus replace decisions. And so those are the next three. What is this, 52 now? Tim, I've lost count, but I think
we were at 50 a couple of months ago. We're at least 52, probably 53. Yeah.
Okay, maybe we should start numbering these things.
Oh my goodness!
Hopefully, I'm not going to. Hopefully, I won't run out of ideas. But finally, as I always do at the end of these webinars, I invite you to sign up for my free monthly email newsletter. You can do that in two ways. You can either go to savvyaviator.com and sign yourself up there, or Tim is going to put up a post-webinar survey as soon as I stop talking, and there'll be a checkbox on that survey that you can check saying that you'd like to be added to the newsletter mailing list. And not to fear, every issue of the newsletter has an unsubscribe link on it, so if you subscribe and you decide it was a terrible mistake, you can always take yourself back off the list. And finally, if you haven't yet checked it out, I encourage you to check out my book called Manifesto, A Revolutionary Approach to General Aviation Maintenance, available on Amazon.com for some ridiculously small amount of money, I think about $12. And it's also available in a Kindle edition. And that is all I have, Tim.
Awesome. Thank you, Mike, so much for this. Very valuable information, very, very relevant safety information for this time of year. I know you sure did open my eyes to these issues and given me a lot to think about, a lot of information, as did the hundreds of people tuned in. I think we probably at one time had probably about 350, 360 tonight tune in, which is a little on the light side for your average. You average normally 500, 600 people, but you know, it's not really a sexy subject. It's not really an eye grabber, maybe. But boy, how important this topic tonight was. Thank you so much.
Well, and particularly this time of year is the time that people should start thinking about this, because it's more than usual. It's a wintertime hazard, and so I'd like to see as many people be aware of this stuff as possible this time of year.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And to all the attendees, thank you so much for tuning in tonight, folks. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. See you next month.